I saw my former billionaire boss begging for food on a cold sidewalk in Manhattan. I was in the back of a limousine worth more than the first apartment I ever lived in. And I gave him $1. He didn't recognize me. Not at first. Not until I lowered the tinted window and said, very calmly, "Do you remember the girl you fired for being poor?" You can imagine the silence that followed. But before we get there, before the limo, before the tailored suits, before the headlines and the market crashes, there was a girl who thought loyalty mattered. A girl who believed hard work was enough. A girl who learned the price of humiliation the day a billionaire decided she didn't fit the image. That girl was me. I'm Kamora. I'm in my 40s now. I've lived long enough to understand that life doesn't always punish people the way we expect. And sometimes, when it does, it's not satisfying the way we imagined. That day in Manhattan wasn't about revenge. At least, that's what I told myself. It was about closure. Or maybe it was about reminding a man who once measured human value in designer labels that poverty isn't contagious, but arrogance is. Let me take you back. 22 years ago, I was 24 and freshly hired at one of the most powerful private investment firms in the country. The kind of place where the lobby smelled like polished marble and ambition. The kind of place where assistants wore heels that cost half my monthly rent. The CEO, my boss, was a financial legend. Self-made. Ruthless. Brilliant. He had the kind of reputation that made grown men straighten their ties when he entered a room. He built empires out of collapsing companies. He bought penthouses the way other people bought coffee. And I worshipped him. Not in a foolish way. In a hungry way. I came from a small apartment above a laundromat in Queens. My mother worked double shifts. My father disappeared before I learned to spell his name. When I got that job offer, I remember sitting on the edge of my childhood bed and crying quietly so my mother wouldn't think I was overwhelmed. I wasn't overwhelmed. I was determined. I ironed my one good blazer the night before my first day. It wasn't designer. It wasn't even new. But it was clean. Sharp. Pressed with purpose. I told myself, if I work twice as hard, they'll never notice I don't belong. And for a while, I believed I was right. But belonging in rooms built by billionaires isn't about effort. It's about optics. And optics, I learned, can erase you in a single afternoon. That's where this really begins. Not on the sidewalk. Not in the limousine. But in a conference room with glass walls, where a man who once praised my work decided I was bad for business simply because my background didn't match his image. I didn't know it then, but that firing would become the most expensive lesson of his life. And mine. Back then, the firm felt like a different universe. The floors were quiet in a controlled way, the kind of quiet that says money is moving even when no one is speaking. The walls were glass. The conference tables were carved from slabs of dark wood shipped in from somewhere expensive. Even the coffee machines looked like they had stock portfolios. I started as an executive assistant. Entry-level. Replaceable. But I treated that job like it was a scholarship. I arrived before sunrise. I left when the cleaning crew came in. I memorized schedules. I anticipated emails before they were sent. I learned how to read a room before a meeting even started. Within 6 months, I wasn't just organizing calendars, I was managing crises. And he noticed. My boss, the billionaire founder, had this way of acknowledging competence without ever giving warmth. A nod. A brief good. Sometimes a glance that meant, "You didn't embarrass me today." To some people, that would have felt cold. To me, it felt like opportunity. He trusted me with sensitive documents. Private calls. Last-minute flight changes that could move markets. When other assistants quit under pressure, I stayed steady. I told myself that if I became indispensable, my background wouldn't matter. The office culture was polished on the surface. Everyone smiled. Everyone dressed impeccably. Charity galas. Fundraisers. Networking dinners at places where the silverware had more courses than the meal. And that's where the subtle divide lived. Most of the staff came from Ivy League schools. Trust funds. Old money families. They talked about ski houses and summer trips to Europe like they were discussing the weather. I talked about making sure my mom's rent was paid. I never lied about where I came from. But I learned to edit. Have you ever done that? Softened your story so it wouldn't make other people uncomfortable? Trimmed pieces of your truth so you could fit inside someone else's expectation? I wonder how many of you have walked into a room and instantly calculated which parts of yourself were acceptable. I didn't resent them. Not at first. I just worked harder. After a year, I earned a promotion. Official title. Salary bump. A seat at strategy meetings, not to speak, but to observe. Still, it felt like progress. I moved my mother into a safer apartment. I bought my first car, used, reliable, nothing flashy. I thought I was building something permanent. And my boss, he seemed to respect me. He once told a visiting investor, "She's efficient. Doesn't complain." That was the closest thing to praise I'd heard from him. But looking back now, I realize something. His respect was conditional. It depended on performance, yes, but also perception. One evening, after a long strategy session, he hosted an impromptu cocktail gathering in the executive lounge. I hadn't known about it in advance. I was still in my standard work outfit, modest heels, simple blouse, that same well-tailored blazer. Everyone else had gone home and returned in designer dresses and sharp suits. I didn't feel embarrassed, I felt slightly out of frame. It was the first time I noticed him looking at me differently. Not critically. Just assessing. Like I had become visible in a way that wasn't entirely flattering. I brushed it off. Because when you're young and ambitious, you don't interpret small shifts as warnings. You interpret them as motivation. But that night, as I waited for the elevator, I caught two junior associates whispering behind me. "She's good at her job," one said quietly. "Yeah," the other replied, "but she doesn't exactly match the brand." Match the brand. I remember that phrase. It lingered longer than it should have. I told myself it didn't matter. I was wrong. The first real crack didn't come with shouting. It came with an invitation. About 6 months after that cocktail evening, the firm secured a massive international deal. Millions in motion. The kind of acquisition that would put my boss on magazine covers again. There was a private investor dinner scheduled at a luxury hotel downtown. My job was to prepare briefing folders and ensure every detail ran perfectly. Seating charts. Dietary preferences. Travel confirmations. The morning of the event, his chief of staff stopped by my desk. "Kamora, the boss wants you there tonight." I blinked. "In what capacity?" "You'll be assisting in real time. He wants you in the room." That was new. Assistants didn't attend investor dinners. We supported from the sidelines. I went home that afternoon both proud and nervous. I owned one formal dress. Black. Simple. Bought on clearance 3 years earlier. It fit well. It wasn't flashy. But it was clean, elegant. I remember standing in front of the mirror, adjusting a loose thread near the hem. You know that moment when you convince yourself you're enough? When you smooth down the doubt and decide to walk in anyway. That was me. The hotel ballroom glittered. Crystal chandeliers. Waiters in white gloves. Women in gowns that whispered money. I kept my posture steady. The evening started smoothly. My boss introduced me to 2 foreign investors as part of the operation's backbone. It wasn't glamorous, but it was acknowledgement. Then it happened. One of the investors, older, sharp-eyed, asked casually where I'd studied. I answered honestly. A public university. Full scholarship. Worked through school. He nodded politely. But my boss's smile tightened. Later, near the bar, I overheard him speaking quietly to that same investor. "She's capable," he said. "Background's modest, but she's useful." Modest. Useful. I felt something small and cold slide into place inside my chest. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. Like I was a tool. Not a professional. Still, I told myself I was being sensitive. But 3 days later, I was called into his office. Glass walls. Closed door. He didn't invite me to sit. "Kamora," he began, fingers steepled, voice calm. "We're restructuring certain client-facing roles." My stomach tightened. "You've done good work," he continued. "However, our brand positioning requires a certain alignment." Alignment. There it was again. Brand. Image. "I'm not sure I understand," I said carefully. He leaned back. "Some of our investors expect representation that reflects their world. Their comfort zone. And then he said it, in that measured, corporate tone. You don't quite fit that picture. The room felt smaller. I wasn't fired that day. Not yet. But my responsibilities were quietly reassigned. Meetings I once attended, I was excluded from. Calls were rerouted. My access reduced. It was professional demotion disguised as strategic adjustment. That was the moment I realized something was shifting beneath my feet. Tell me honestly, if you were in that position, what would you have done? Confront him outright? Demand clarity? Or stayed quiet and observed, hoping it was temporary? I chose to observe. And that decision would cost me more than I expected. Because suspicion, once planted, doesn't stay quiet. It grows. The official termination happened on a Tuesday morning. No warning. No performance review. No written complaints. Just a calendar invite labeled alignment discussion. By then, I already knew what it meant. When I walked into his office, he didn't look up right away. That, more than anything, told me the decision was final. He was signing something. Probably paperwork with my name on it. Kamora, he said, still calm. We've decided to move in a different direction. Different direction. Corporate language is remarkable. It can strip dignity out of a sentence without raising its voice. I've met every metric, I replied evenly. My hands were steady. I made sure of that. Yes, he acknowledged. But this isn't about metrics. There it was. Clean. Precise. This is about positioning, he continued. We need executives and support staff who reflect the level we operate on. Reflect the level. I held his gaze. And I don't. A pause. Not long. Just long enough. You come from a different background. Our clients notice these things. He didn't say the word poor. He didn't have to. The implication hung there between us like smoke. I remember something very specific about that moment. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was embarrassed. Not because I had done something wrong, but because my history had been placed on a scale and judged unworthy of proximity to wealth. That kind of humiliation settles deep. If you've ever been dismissed not for your work, but for who you are, you know the ache I'm talking about. It's not loud. It's heavy. And it lingers long after the conversation ends. He offered me a severance package. Generous, by technical standards. 3-month salary. A recommendation letter carefully worded to protect his reputation. I signed it. Not because I agreed, but because I understood power. As I packed my desk, no one made eye contact. A few whispered apologies. Most avoided me altogether. Reputation is contagious in places like that, and they were afraid of catching mine. When I reached the lobby, the marble floors looked colder than they had on my first day. Outside, the city noise swallowed me whole. That afternoon, I went home and told my mother I had decided to explore new opportunities. I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. But 2 weeks later, the real discovery happened. A former colleague, one of the junior analysts who actually had a conscience, met me for coffee. He looked uneasy. You didn't hear this from me, he said quietly. But after that investor dinner, there were comments. Concerns about optics. Optics again. They said some clients questioned whether the firm was attracting top-tier talent if support staff didn't match the lifestyle. Match the lifestyle. And he agreed. I asked. The analyst nodded. He said image was part of the product. Image was part of the product. That sentence cracked something open in me. I hadn't been let go because of budget cuts, that I hadn't been let go because of incompetence. I had been let go because poverty, even former poverty, didn't photograph well next to billionaires. And suddenly, all the small moments made sense. The tightened smile at the gala. The reassigned meetings. The subtle distance. It wasn't random. It was strategic. I went home that night and allowed myself to feel it fully. The betrayal. The dismissal. The quiet violence of being deemed off-brand. There's a specific kind of grief that comes when you realize someone you respected never actually respected you back. It's humbling. It's clarifying. And it forces you to rebuild your identity from scratch. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I made a promise to myself. Not about revenge. Not about proving him wrong. but about never again shrinking my story to make someone else comfortable. I didn't know then how that promise would play out. I only knew one thing. He thought he had erased me. He hadn't. For a few weeks after the firing, I let the silence settle. No dramatic LinkedIn posts. No emotional emails. No public scenes. Just space. People assume that when you're humiliated like that, you either explode or collapse. I did neither. I observed. The severance bought me time, and time is power when you use it correctly. I reviewed everything. My performance reports. Client feedback. Internal communications. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for clarity. If I had failed, I needed to know how. If I hadn't, I needed to understand why image outweighed competence. And the answer was simple. In his world, wealth wasn't just currency. It was branding. That realization shifted something in me. Because if image was part of the product, then I needed to understand branding better than he did. Instead of scrambling for another assistant role, I enrolled in evening finance courses. Advanced certification. Corporate communications. Investor relations. I used part of my severance to invest in myself, strategically. During the day, I freelanced. Operational consulting for small firms that couldn't afford billionaires but still valued precision. I helped startups structure processes. Clean up internal systems. Prepare for funding rounds. And here's what I discovered. In smaller rooms, I wasn't off-brand. I was essential. I understood efficiency. I understood resilience. I understood what it meant to stretch resources without compromising integrity. Skills you learn when you grow up without a safety net. Within a year, I wasn't job hunting anymore. I was building. It started as a consultancy. Then it expanded into strategic operations advisory. I partnered with founders who cared more about results than appearances. Slowly, my client list grew. I didn't advertise loudly. I delivered quietly. There's a difference. Every contract I signed felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Not in defiance of him, but in alignment with who I actually was. Still, I'd be lying if I said I never thought about him. When I read articles about his expanding empire, I felt a flicker of something. Not envy. Not quite anger. More like unfinished business. But here's the truth I came to understand. Success built on insecurity is fragile. He needed rooms full of people who looked wealthy to validate his brand. I needed rooms full of people who valued competence. Different currencies. As my firm grew, so did my confidence. 5 years after being fired, I had a small but respected advisory company. 10 years later, we were managing high-level operational restructurings for mid-sized investment groups. Ironically, some of those groups competed directly with his firm. I never spoke his name. I never told clients my origin story. I didn't need to. Results speak without emotion. And somewhere along the way, the pain shifted into perspective. But let me ask you something honestly. When someone humiliates you publicly, do you believe the strongest response is to walk away and build quietly? Or to confront them directly and demand acknowledgement? I wrestled with that question for years. Part of me believed silence was dignity. Another part believed accountability mattered. I didn't know which side I would choose if I ever saw him again. I didn't expect to get that choice. Life has a strange way of arranging encounters when you least need them. The day I saw him again, I wasn't looking for closure. I was simply on my way to a board meeting. And I almost didn't recognize him. Almost. It was late afternoon in Manhattan. Traffic was thick. My driver had just turned onto a side street near Midtown when I noticed a small cluster of people near the curb. At first, I didn't look twice. New York is full of stories on sidewalks. But then I saw him. Thinner. Older. Shoulders bent inward. A cardboard sign resting against his knees. I leaned forward. Stopped the car. The limousine eased to the curb. For a moment, I just stared through the tinted glass. The man who once measured human worth by appearance was sitting on concrete in a worn coat, asking strangers for spare change. There was no security team. No polished shoes. No marble lobby. Just wind. And noise. And indifference. I didn't feel triumph. I felt, still. My driver glanced back. I'll be a moment. I pressed the button and lowered the window halfway. He approached automatically, eyes down, voice hoarse. Anything helps. God bless. He didn't recognize me. Of course he didn't. To him, I had been background. Replaceable. Off-brand. I reached into my purse and pulled out a $1 bill. 1. I held it between my fingers for a second longer than necessary. And then I handed it to him. Our eyes met briefly. Polite gratitude. No awareness. He started to turn away. That's when I spoke. Do you remember the girl you fired for being poor? His head snapped back toward the window. Confusion first. Then recognition. It was subtle, the way his eyes widened, the way his mouth parted slightly as memory rearranged his face. Camora, he whispered. I held his gaze. No anger in my voice. No raised tone. Just clarity. You said I didn't reflect the level you operated on. Silence between us. Cars honked behind the limo. He looked down at the dollar in his hand. Then back at me. For a second, just one, I saw it. Not pride. Not defiance. Shame. Now I know some of you might think that was cruel. Stopping the car. Saying those words. Was it necessary? Was it compassionate? I won't pretend there's a universal answer. You're allowed to feel however you feel about it. But here's what mattered to me in that moment. I wasn't there to mock him. I wasn't there to gloat. I was there to remind him that worth doesn't evaporate when money does. And poverty isn't a moral failure. He opened his mouth as if to explain. To justify. To apologize. I didn't wait. I hope you've learned, I said quietly. Image isn't character. Then I pressed the button. The window slid up. The barrier returned. And just like that, the roles were reversed, but I wasn't interested in reversing humiliation. I tapped the glass lightly. Drive. The limo pulled away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, smaller with distance, holding that dollar. Holding that memory. And I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel powerful. I felt finished. No backstory. No dramatic music. Just a sentence spoken into the open air, exactly 22 years after it should have been said. Closure doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's just a window rolling up. After we pulled away, the city kept moving like nothing monumental had just happened. Taxis cut in front of us. Pedestrians crossed against the light. A delivery truck blocked half the lane. Manhattan doesn't pause for anyone's redemption arc. And inside that limousine, I sat back and let my heartbeat settle. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. For years, I had imagined what I might say if I ever saw him again. In some versions, I was sharper. In others, more forgiving. But the reality was quieter than all of it. I had said exactly one thing that mattered. And then I left. That night, I went home to a penthouse I had earned without compromising who I was. Not inherited. Not handed down. Built. Slowly. Strategically. Brick by brick through contracts, negotiations, and long nights of problem-solving. But as I stood in my kitchen looking out at the skyline, something unexpected surfaced. Sadness. Not for him. For the younger version of me. The girl who thought approval from powerful men was proof of value. The girl who believed fitting into someone else's brand was the same as success. I poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting that truth settle. Money changes your address. It doesn't change your origin story. And here's what I lost along the way. I lost a decade of second-guessing myself. I lost time spent wondering if I should have dressed differently, spoken differently, hidden my background more carefully. But here's what endured. My work ethic. My loyalty to the people who deserved it. My refusal to lie about where I came from. Those things survived humiliation. And what changed forever? My understanding of power. Power isn't how high you sit. It's how stable you remain when you fall. A few months after that encounter, I heard through industry circles that his firm had collapsed years earlier after a series of reckless expansions. Investors pulled out. Lawsuits followed. Assets dissolved. I didn't investigate further. I didn't need details. Consequences have their own timelines. Midway through that winter, I found myself thinking about the encounter again. Not replaying it. Just examining it. Would I do it the same way if given another chance? That's an honest question. Would I still stop the car? Still hand him $1? Still say those words? I think, yes. Not because he deserved humiliation, but because I deserved acknowledgement. There's a difference. And I wonder about you. Are there moments in your past where you wish you had spoken up? Where silence protected your peace but left something unsaid? Or are you grateful for the restraint you showed? Life doesn't give us rehearsals. Only consequences. The truth is, that dollar wasn't about money. It was symbolic. Once, he decided I wasn't polished enough to stand beside wealth. Years later, I stood beside him without needing his validation. That's the part that mattered. I never saw him again after that day. But I carried the lesson forward. In my own company, we don't ask about pedigree before we ask about competence. We don't measure polish before we measure integrity. I've hired assistants who remind me of myself. Ambitious, sharp, maybe a little out of place in rooms they've fought to enter. And I make sure they never feel off-brand. Because brands fade. Character doesn't. When I finally went to bed that night, I didn't replay his face. I replayed my own composure. And for the first time in years, the memory of being fired no longer stung. It felt resolved. Not erased. Just complete. If you've stayed with me this far, you probably understand that this story was never really about $1. It wasn't about a limousine. And it wasn't even about a fallen billionaire. It was about worth. The kind that doesn't fluctuate with market crashes. The kind that doesn't shrink because someone with power decides you don't match the brand. When I was 24, I believed success meant proximity to wealth. I believed that if the powerful accepted me, I had made it. Losing that job felt like being pushed out of a castle I had finally been invited into. But here's what age has taught me. If someone can remove you from their table because of your background, you were never truly seated as an equal. Real respect isn't conditional. Real leadership doesn't require uniformity. And poverty, whether current or former, is not a stain. It's a story. Sometimes it's even a strength. I've replayed that moment on the sidewalk many times, not to savor it, but to understand it. He had built an empire on perception. On image. On polished surfaces. When those surfaces cracked, there was nothing underneath strong enough to hold him up. I had built my life on competence. On persistence. On refusing to apologize for where I started. When I was pushed out, I bent. But I didn't break. There's a difference. Before I close this story, I want to leave you with something to sit with. When someone underestimates you, when they reduce your value to optics, income, background, or status, what do you believe is the right response? Is it forgiveness? Is it confrontation? Is it silent success? There isn't a single correct answer. Some people heal by walking away quietly. Some heal by speaking truth directly. Some heal by doing both. What matters is that you don't internalize someone else's narrow definition of worth. Because once you do, you start shrinking yourself to fit rooms that were never designed for you. I don't hate my former boss. I don't even resent him anymore. In a strange way, he gave me clarity. He showed me exactly what kind of leader I never wanted to become. And that lesson was worth more than any salary he ever paid me. So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far Kimura's voice travels. Never let someone else's insecurity define the size of your future.